Okay, so I'll get started. So this is work that keeps me interested and excited and angry. Because the more I learn about the sort of the history of academic publishing in the Second World War, and the ways in which commercial and inevitably commercial publishers have dominated the scene, and been the ones to constantly innovate and constantly create new advances, makes it very, very hard for non-commercial publishers and university presses to keep up. So this paper is a particular reflection on what's happening, particularly at the moment. I focus particularly on African publishing, but that's a reflection of this global publishing landscape. So you all know, well, if you don't know who this is the local Oxford boy. What he's not know, he's someone who grew up in Czechoslovakia. It's Robert Maxwell, and he's a bit of a Trumpish figure, I think. Here he is astride of London. He took a picture of himself on top of this office block, and actually, I can't see his piece off, but it's a rather ugly sort of. He's on the roof of the Euro newspaper's office block, and he's sort of astride the world, sort of. So he was very skillful, growing up in a poor part of Czechoslovakia, in a rural area. Learned many languages, watched his father be a brilliant trader. Ambition to fight in the Second World War, joins the resistance, joins the British Army, ends up getting an honour in the army for bravery in battle. It's brilliantly skillful with languages, ends up as an intelligence officer in Berlin after the war. And good at deals, good at intrigue, becomes a double agent for the Russians and for the British. And the issue is getting as much German scientific knowledge out of Berlin back to the Allied side as possible. Because there are lots of German publishers, of course, at that point, many science journals were published in German, and chemistry was the first sort of global science. You had to learn German into the 60s in Britain to study chemistry, because all the journals are in German. So he realizes that there's this huge valuable asset, which is scientific knowledge, scientific journals, publishers that haven't been able to get their stuff out. And he cuts some deals and sets himself up as a publisher in Britain in 1951, having shipped out lots of copies from Berlin. He does a deal to sell these copies of books, and there's journals, it's all sorts of things. And from there, you see this empire build. He is brilliantly good at recruiting editors, charming them. This is a tent in his garden, which is in Headington, where I live. He managed to convince the council to rent him Headington House, which is this decaying, beautiful Georgian house on the hill. And he used to boast it was the cheapest council house in Britain because he paid nothing for it and looked after it, but built it. That was his publishing HQ. And he was very good at was making editors feel very special, academics not feeling special. So he dined them, and took them on holidays. And as you can see, look at this pompous tent with all the food. And in doing so, he realized that there was an endless market for journals. Okay? He realized he could expand and expand and expand. And it was almost like a question of, well, and there was a lovely anecdote of him going to the hospitality management department in what's now Brooks University, was then Oxford Poly, and saying, look, we need a journal of hospitality management, and of course there is one now. He was brilliant at creating new fields, at realizing where there were spaces, but of course at marketing and doing deals with journal libraries, and this is where the whole notion of a sort of bundle develops, because he would sell not just a few journals, but he'd be able to sell a whole package of journals to a library. And he was very good at turning national journals into international journals, giving new names, international journal rather than a national journal. He would publish for associations, and it was a model that basically enabled scholarly societies to get rich. And scholarly societies were often running on a shoestring, and if you could have a bit of income from your journals, then you could do lots of other things like supporting young scholars, having nice conferences. And that's why now been able to look at the higher education landscape here in the UK, and you look at that research in higher education, it has some very, very profitable journals, and so does the CIE Association. And there's an awful lot of money because the commercial publishers have made it really hard for them to leave. Because if you left, you wouldn't be able to fund anything you did. So that's the real challenge for academics across the, and we're all part of that because we all publish in these journals. We all benefit from these societies. Now, this one I'm going to tell you about a parallel story, and this is the story of an American information scientist called Eugene Garfield, who after the war, again, the Americans, the war had been won on science, Second World War, and on nuclear bombs, obviously, but radar and scientific advances were key to what happened in the war. So after the war, there was this huge investment in American science, and a huge number of journals. It wasn't just Robert Maxwell. Elsevier was expanding. There were, the American Chemical Society. There were loads and loads of journals being launched all over the place. And Eugene Garfield said, "Look, how are we going to manage this knowledge flow?" And he comes up with this very clever commercial product, which is called current content. So he just sits and photocopies pages of the abstracts of journals, because librarians are overwhelmed. They don't know which journals to buy. They don't know where to start. And he sells this package particularly to universities, but also to companies. And that becomes a very profitable sort of line for him. And on the basis of that, then he comes up with this much more sort of, not megalomania, but sort of incredible idea that what if you could create an index of all knowledge, not through an alphabetical index as we imagine, but an index of knowledge flows, of citations, who's citing who's citing who. Okay, and so the idea is, it's sort of been influential in the web as well, because the whole metrics of page ranking is based on the algorithms that he was trying to develop, which was, how do you create a sort of hyperlinked web of knowledge? And for someone in the 50s with an ambitious, he set up a company, but the task of processing, what he started with was 1,000 journals. Okay, now think of 1,000 journals, and you've got to do backgrounds of all of them, and then you look at all the articles and all the references in all of the articles, type them all into a computer, see when they're linked to other ones, and then develop a computer processor that can generate this index of all the citations linked together. I mean, it's an incredible achievement for the early 60s. And so you can see why he said, well, look, we can't possibly index all the journals. There's no way. Let's just choose the 1,000 most important ones. And he came up with this argument that actually it was a power law. Those of you who know quantity, 80% of the references citations were in 20% of the journals. And so there was a mathematician called Bradford's law of scattering, and so Garfield turned it into the Garfield law of sort of concentration, that most of the sources would be most of the articles would point to a few sources. And I mean, actually, you can see that quite quickly that his number of journals he put in the index did grow over time, because everyone wanted to be in the index. Who didn't want to be in the index? Because if you weren't indexed, somehow you weren't visible. He made huge amounts of loss on this. He never made a profit ever. Okay, and he eventually had to sell it to Thomson's Reuters in the 1990s. But what's interesting about this list is which journals were initially indexed. Well, as you can see, it was mostly the US journals. So the US made up for half, and the UK, so together they made up 2/3. Because of course those are the people who were buying this current content. They were the ones who actually were probably viable customers. Perhaps they were the best organized publishers. And so right from the start, you spew a landscape of science by saying, okay, well, actually, there is this global science landscape, but really within that, we can be very picky about which journals count. And so the African journals, there's very few. There's 3 from India. You can see whole gaps in the landscape here. Very few from Russia. 10. Given the Russian science system, obviously perhaps the Chinese science system was less developed in the 60s, but no journals from China either. And so this is important because, of course, once you're in a citation index, then you get more citations. Your journals get more citations, and therefore there is a sort of a logic of exclusion/inclusion, that it's very, very hard to get in, and it's quite hard to throw it out because your metrics improve. So understanding that explains, I think, why we still have such a skewed science system now, because of the way in which Garfield skewed it, and because of the way in which inevitably the commercial publishers like Maxwell, like I said, they were brilliant at marketing and at getting their journals into libraries and visible. And the reason that this citation index matters even more now is that once it was digitized in the 1990s, I mean, the early copies, you can actually go to the library and get the print copies out. And so I got them out, and there's huge tomes of these indexes. You can just flick through them, because it was all, they didn't have CD-ROMs or floppy disks until the 80s. And so it was all printed out. Anyway, now, of course, it's digitized. And at that point, once it was digitized, you could mine it. And so here, 2025, this is the Times Hires. This is the weighting they use for their rankings. Okay, and you probably can see, but it's a bit small. Sorry, the citation impact is 15% out of the weighting. Research strength is 5. Research productivity is 5. So at least 20 or 25% of the overall ranking is based on your citation numbers, impact, strength, volume. Okay, which of course is why you're a university in Ghana or a university in South India. This really matters to get into the rankings, and therefore it really matters to get your citations up. But therefore it really matters your academics publish in cited journals, and therefore you really incentivize your academics through money or promotion to insist on only publishing in cited journals. But that's the logic, and therefore journals that are new, that don't fit into that sort of model, suffer. One response, of course, is that we're all publishing a lot more. This is this actually has been now published in a quantitative science journal, but this was just a picture from their Impact Social Sciences blog. In the space of 10 years, Elsevier has almost doubled. It's sort of 80% more articles being published by the top journal publishing Elsevier. And obviously, you can see this is MDPI, which is a sort of challenger publisher, very good at getting citations, quite assertive in its business model. Questions obviously about quality sometimes, but obviously some very good journals are very cited as well. So MDPI is the biggest challenger, Frontiers as well. And then, but you can also see all the big publishers are all increasing there. You've got Springer and Wiley, certainly. Again, it's at least a 50% increase. And so what I want to describe is what I think is going on now in the social sciences anyway, which is sort of where we are, is sort of 2 or 3 interlinked economies, political economies. And so one is the old one we know, which is the credibility one, where you have an editor who has a really strong vision, who's really good peer reviewers. Often some peer reviews in some fields go on for years. It's really tough to get published in some journals, and that's because it's curated as a strong, clear vision, and that's what I would call a credibility economy. And in any field, you can identify core journals that everyone aspires to get into, so that credibility is carefully maintained. But that is also linked now to an output economy, because I don't think you can just rely on a credibility. You also need to have volume, and the reason you need to have volume, which is so you need to have your elite journals. You also need to be able to cascade articles down. So even Nature, the brand Nature, there's one Nature journal, but there are now 50 Nature branded journals. So at some point along the way, you can get into Nature Communications, or there's a, and they charge the ones at the bottom charge APCs as well, where the top ones, you can publish in Nature without paying an APC. But if you pay an APC, it's £10,000, and it's hugely expensive. Anyway, so the point here is that you need the output numbers to generate the metadata, because the third economy here is the generation, use, and sale of metadata by publishers. So every article, you can only find it if it's got good metadata, and that's of course as much detail as you can about the journal article, about the author, and everything connected to the article itself. So Elsevier no longer calls itself a publisher; it calls itself a data analytics company. And so you have this output economy where you scale up because you can make money by having more, publishing more. So Taylor and Francis, interestingly, in relation to Africa, and I'm going to go on to tell about this, it has really invested in publishing African authors. So I've written about what you might call bibliometric coloniality. So we're reinforcing a sort of colonial model through the metrics of a sort of bibliometric sort of data economy. So Africa continues to suffer. I mean, these headlines haven't gone away. They've been around for 50 years, okay? And indeed, the first critiques of the citation index were in the 70s and 80s. So this is not new, okay? Someone in Scientific American did a piece on that, and Garfield was really cross, made the case. There's the quality journals in Africa. How could you possibly criticize the science citation index? It was an objective measure, and that piece is really interesting to read. So I always want to show you a couple of consequences of this. This is a list of Ethiopian journals. It doesn't really matter. You really can't see them, other than that. There are African indexes, something that there were platforms anyway. One's called Age-old African Journals Online. So even though there are 60 journals, Ethiopian journals, that are, strong, well-regarded journals that have been publishing for a while, and they've been scored and ranked on this African platform, only 6 of them are indexed in Scopus and 2 in Web of Science. So that gives you a sense of the invisibility. This is, again, I won't go into detail here, but this is a list of Nigerian journals that have been removed from Scopus, either because they're not publishing regularly enough, or because, probably that's the main reason, or because there were questions about citation patterns. So Scopus, as one of the citation indexes, which is the rival now to Web of Science, they'll monitor journals, and they'll expect a certain diversity of authorship and citations and so on. And so if all your authors are from Nigeria, because it's a Nigerian medical journal, that's not seen as a market. So they have all sorts of ways of sort of worrying about quality. And you can see why. So I just want to compare 2 journals, quite briefly, just to explain what's going on. The one on the left is a mega journal, okay? It's called Cogent Social Sciences. You may have heard of it, you may have published in it. It publishes all across the social sciences, okay, and every field. It was set up in 2015 by Taylor and Francis, okay? And the one on the right, set up in 2003 by a Nigerian political philosopher who set up a publisher called Adonis and Abbey. He realized he wanted to get his ambition for publishing was, if I give it an English sounding name, that will help, and give it a London address, it'll help. So it's registered in London and in Lagos. It's called Adonis and Abbey because it's the start of the alphabet. And he's worked really hard to build up a journal, suite of journals in the social sciences. But look at the data on how these 2 journals compare in terms of citations. So on the left, Cogent Social Sciences starts in 2015 and rapidly goes up to 500 papers a year being published, 500 papers a year in one journal. And here is the citations shooting up as well, because of course Taylor and Francis is able to generate the metadata, is able to generate the visibility of the journals, that generates the citations, that generate this reputation. Whereas, if you look at the scales here, this is the African Renaissance Journal. It publishes about 50 journals, articles a year, and the citations, well, look, it's really, really low. It's really, really low until 2019. Suddenly it shoots up. Why does it shoot up? Because it's suddenly finally indexed. The publisher has convinced Scopus that this is a strong journal, even though it's not being cited very much, because he's got a track record. He can show the quality of the papers. So that's so interesting. The importance of being indexed for citations. And this is another final table that's really interesting. This is a list of the top universities that publish in Cogent Social Science. Okay, they're all African. Okay, so there's a couple from Indonesia, but nearly all the rest are all in yellow. They're from South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria. And so this is really interesting that rather than African journals being encouraged to publish in African journals, African authors publishing in African journals, they're publishing in a Taylor and Francis journal, because of course it's an index. Okay, so you could say, well, that's fine. At least they're getting published. But because it's a mega journal, there's no conversation or community. There's no sort of curation. There's no real sort of debate. You can just get your paper published in a hurry. I mean, it's out there, which is fine. But is it being found? Is it being read? I mean, it's being cited because Taylor and Francis does that, and Taylor and Francis offer a fee waiver through some philanthropic. So they're managing to get the metadata from African authors. They're managing to offer fee waivers. They're managing to get all these papers that I would argue should be going into African conversations in African-based communities. And there are 2 other mega journals, 2 other publishers are doing the same. So these are mega open access journals. Is this the future of scholarship? We published in, what's a journal for if it's just a mega repository of papers? So final slide then. I'm happy to talk more about African research ecosystems, but basically, apart from South Africa, which is, has incredible subsidies for publishing, and that's built quite a commercial publishing economy, and distorts the rest of the region. Most of Africa, there's very little money, so it's an economy of scarcity, and you're either doing things on a shoestring, or you're having to try and charge a few pence for articles. It's very difficult to make a publishing model work. Remembering, in journal publishing is free. It costs expensive. So the final slide is, how might we imagine an Afro-structuring of African publishing? This is a term by a Senegalese scholar called Pendaba. She calls for an Afro-structure, which is endogenously financed, which would mean African nations committing to research and development, open to all, attentive to diversity, recognizing all sorts of scientific work. So it's a lovely post-colonial model. The question is the finances and political will there? And does it matter that it'll be really hard to compete with the main commercial publishers? The risk, of course, is monoculture, isn't it? We know, and what the monoculture means, we lose creativity, we lose diversity. So yeah, that's where I end. Then is our African research being forced to choose between credibility, productivism, and all these global commercial publishers. And I published a book on it with some colleagues called Who Counts? That's open access and downloadable. Sorry, I've gone a bit long.
Take some questions. Please.
There's no one online chatting, but questions, but I can see that as well.
Good. Any questions?
Thank you for a most interesting presentation, David. Very, very interesting. One of the frustrations I've had in citing colleagues who publish in South African journals and in reading the journals and even contemplating publishing is that their websites are so bloody rudimentary. And I have to go through so many gateways, none of them familiar to me, that even that, I think, is an obstacle. Second point, there's one, it's either WITS or University of Cape Town, that requires as a condition of internal research grants that they publish in an X.
Yes, that's right.
Index, and so they are imposing on themselves a colonialization of their.
Absolutely.
And you haven't yet proposed a way of evaluating the quality of work aside from these global north metric indices. And perhaps Africa needs to develop its own understanding of quality and standard that it can introduce.
Good. Okay, thank you. Shall I respond to that? Yeah. So firstly, yes, websites are rudimentary. And that's because we've all got used to commercial platforms. Okay. And so there is something called the Open Journal System software, which is a really brave initiative set up by a guy called John Wilinski and the Public Knowledge Project in Canada, which was designed, and it is an open source journal publishing platform. Anyone can download it and you can publish a journal tomorrow. And that's great, but it means that it's almost like it's made things too simple to a certain extent. You do need to have something which is a bit more visible and easy to use. And of course, one of the challenges when you've got low bandwidth and technical, you might not have the latest software, compatibility issues. So again and again, you'll hit dead ends on African university websites because they'll move portals, and that's quite hard work. Then you asked the question about bits requiring academics to publish internationally. Well, that was the point I was trying to make, was that it's a requirement of a promotion, if not a grant, to publish in an index journal. And of course, South Africa has some brilliant index journals. And actually, if you look at the number of African journals in Scopus, there are 260, 100 from Egypt, 100 from South Africa, and 60 from the rest of the continent. Okay, so South Africa does have a global research community. And then the final question you asked was about metrics, and I think once upon a time before metrics, we relied on peer review, and we still do rely on peer review for quality. that's what the community of scholars is about. So, and you know, there are many African journals that are brilliantly peer reviewed and people are very committed. If we think of substituting that we measure quality by are they in the index and are they being cited, then we're losing. You know, that's a problem, I think, for the sort of human relationships that I mean, obviously peer review has its problems and there are cartels, and you know we can all review each other's work, and you know there's lots of debates about how to make peer review better and how to make it value, you know, how to do it, because of course it's time consuming. But I think the principle is the only one we've got, I think, which is, you know, peer relationships and reviews.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question. So you had said when they publish in like Taylor and Francis, so like do they not? They do have access to it, right? So
they have
the
access.
community is just different. You're just saying it's more of an international community rather than like a small.
Yeah, it's a good question. So why is it a problem? So
I can see why it's a problem.
no. So I mean, the reason they're publishing in those in a mega journal is that the history of some of these more the credibility economies is often the tight gatekeeping. Okay, so in something, you know, in a social science field, the long established journals, whether it's in higher education, you know, it'll be harder for an African-based author to understand the game to get in. Yeah. And that's why many journals find it really hard to diversify their authorship, because unless you've got a real commitment from the editorial team to go out and do writing workshops and support people to understand that journal culture, you just have saying you have your students right. You know, there's a reproduction of a community of scholarship, and so I think you have to work hard then to think, how do you change that? And it's possible to change, but what's quite clever about what Taylor and Francis and the other commercial publishers have done is said, right, well, actually, look, you know, we know that you like our top journals, but why don't you publish in our mega journals? Because, you know, it's much easier to publish in those, and we'll publish you really quickly. And you know, they're waiving their fees because of a philanthropic deal that they've got through an organization called the EIFL. So they're not losing money, but they're getting a lot of data and getting authors into their system. And I guess the question is does that matter for African research systems if you have no journals published in Africa? And I think probably it does.
It does.
Yes. Yeah.
Shall we go to
Yeah,
Alyssa?
of course, yes.
Back to any questions towards the end. Thank you. Alyssa, what do you start presenting? Very good.
Hi everyone, apologies that I can't be there in person today, but hopefully you can hear me all right, and if maybe give me a thumbs up. Beautiful, lovely. Okay, I'll just start sharing my screen and confirm that you can see that.
Brilliant.
Excellent. Okay. So my name's Melissa Bond. I'm a research fellow at the Epicenter at University College London, as well as an adjunct associate professor in qualitative evidence synthesis at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And I'm really delighted to be part of this panel today. I'm going to be looking, taking a slightly different approach to the topic and looking in particular at one specific journal as a case study today. And that journal is the International Journal of Educational Technology in Higher Education. So to explain why this fits into the conversation today, we already know, and I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about this later on, but we already know that editorial boards of journals are dominated by researchers from the global north. For example, areas like education, but also sociology, environmental science, and public health. We also know that it's been shown that the ethnicity of authors in, for example, the land use science discipline is biased towards white authors, as well as followed by Asian, Hispanic, and Black researchers. And there's a long history of this conscious and unconscious bias within publishing. We also know that there is a gender disparity in editorial boards. Not just the editors themselves, but also editorial board members. who form part of the, I guess a wider sort of advisory body for a particular journal's direction and culture. And this has been found across a variety of different topics, disciplinary areas as well. But we also know that, for example, there's been an analysis of the gender composition of the top 5 journals in economics, which found that low representation of women on editorial boards reduces the number of articles that are co-authored by women, whereas higher levels of representation increase the quantity of female authorship. So, and from a lot of the research that I do is in the field of educational technology and computers and education. Speaking of the SSCI, it's ranked second at the moment in education and educational research, and it is the top ranked educational technology journal. And the disparity of gender representation there is also highly felt. So I was actually asked to conduct this case study of the International Journal of Educational Technology and Higher Education. It's a very long name. I'll just call it IJETA for short. Because it was their 20th anniversary, they are actually currently ranked 4th in the SSCI Education and Educational Research citations list. So they are quite highly respected, but they have a very interesting history. In that they aren't one of these, they don't have a legacy, I suppose, like, for example, the British Journal of Educational Technology, which ranks, has a longer history, a 50-year history of academic publishing, and is very prestigious. However, it's ranked below this particular journal, IJETA, in the list. So in order to, when I was asked to do that, I decided to, not just look at research trends and issues, but really focus on, how the journal has kind of contributed to furthering scholarship. How has it contributed to representing voices of those who perhaps have been traditionally underrepresented? And that's what I'll be focusing in particular on today, is these particular questions as part of that analysis. So the journal actually started out being published solely in Spanish. It was a Spanish journal coming from a Spanish institution. So one university started this particular journal. And sort of the first 10 or so years, that was the case. And then they joined in a partnership with university in Australia, as well as eventually a couple of other international countries. And they started publishing in English. And then quite recently, really, they were then indexed in the SSCI. So I decided to, rather than just focus on, this one particular metric that we've been talking about, I decided to use a framework that's been used, particularly in educational technology in the past, called the Rigor, Influence and Prestige Framework by Rich and West, who look beyond metrics alone to assess the quality of a journal. And I used the 631 articles that have been published in this particular journal since 2010, which is when they started actually publishing in English. And I conducted this analysis using a number of different bibliometric and content analysis methods. This is a snapshot of the articles in this corpus across time. And as you can see in particular, which is important, and I will come back to it later, is the rise in the number of evidence syntheses that you can see here. So things like systematic reviews, meta-analysis, and that kind of publication. So as part of this framework that I use, the Rigor, Influence and Prestige, this journal has a very low acceptance rate. Last year alone, they received over 2,000 submissions. And they only published something like 64 articles from those submissions. And one of the reasons behind that, and I think one of the reasons behind its very sharp introduction into the higher echelons of the SSCI, is because it's actually published as completely open access. They don't have any article processing charges. And the costs are actually paid for by the 4 cooperative institutions, the 4 universities who run the journal. And so that is obviously very attractive to authors when they're looking to submit to this particular journal. As I said, it is ranked in the top 2 of EdTech behind computers and education. They publish their articles ongoing throughout the year. They're not committed to a certain publishing structure or timeline, and they have a very strong social media presence, which has seen it, in my opinion, has strongly influenced its rise in the ranking. In terms of the editorial board geographical distribution, though, we see a very strong representation from Europe, with over half of the editorial board coming from that location. And partially this would be due to the legacy of the journal having started out in Spain. But it's also got a very, very strong North American contingent, and to a lesser extent, and perhaps due to the linguistic connection in South and Central America. But very little representation from other parts of the world. In terms of the gender distribution, quite pleasingly, they actually had a fairly even parity, reasonably even parity between females and males. And I do want to caveat all of this by saying I actually hand coded all of the articles. I didn't just rely on the metrics that were provided by the Web of Science, by Scopus, or by the journal themselves, because I have found an inconsistency in the indexing of some of the articles that have been published by this journal, but also by other top journals in the field. So we know that there's reasonable gender parity. They had a diverse international advisory board, but there is that heavy European and North American representation on the editorial board in terms of their prestige. When we look at author geographical distribution, we actually see a very similar distribution as we saw with the editorial board. But this time we see a higher representation of Asian authors. But again, a very low representation from the Global South. In terms of when we look at these author distribution across time, I separated the articles into 3 time periods based on previous analyses that had been done in the field. And you can see that whilst the representation from Europe has decreased over time and therefore increased with certain other areas of the world, we still see actually a reduced representation by African authors and South American authors across those time periods. In terms of gender distribution, again, actually quite pleasing. Whilst we started off with a fairly strong male representation, we actually saw an increase in female authorship until we got to the pandemic. And I think we know there were other issues going on, particularly for females and family responsibilities during that time, which may explain some of that disparity. But also pleasingly seeing that female representation is increasing again. So then I looked at the highest cited articles during that period, during the period from 2016 to 2024, to consider what kind of, okay, so these are the top cited, and I looked at both, not just the Web of Science, not just the SSCI citations, but also Google Scholar, and I also looked at altmetric scores. So this is the social media presence. It's how often these publications might have been cited in policy documents and in news, blogs, so on and so forth. So it's another way of being able to look at the data and consider the strength and reputation of some of this work. So I considered also who are these authors that are being cited so often, and found a stronger male representation in these authors as first authors, this is, of those articles. I also saw a very quite an interesting, but yet again a very like mirroring what we saw with the author representation across continents. Again, we see high, very, very high European, North American dominance, followed by a very, very small, followed by Asia, then Africa, Middle East, Oceania, and none from South and Central America in those top cited articles. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was how often we're now seeing, and admittedly, this is an area of passion of mine, is evidence synthesis. How often we're seeing the rise of systematic reviews, of meta-analyses, and of, state-of-the-art type reviews. And you can see this represented in the highest cited articles. But that, sort of begs the question, well, what is the quality of these reviews, and what kind of research is then going into these reviews that is then being used to perpetuate, to look at where is the evidence coming from? Who are the authors that are publishing the research going into these reviews? Which is a topic that I'm now following up on in another project. But in terms of the quality of these evidence syntheses, even despite the fact that these are being published in such a prestigious journal, we see that actually the quality is middling at best. And where we need the robustness to come from in evidence syntheses is in providing the key information on where this research is coming from, on which search terms they use, on which databases they've used. Did they search in AJOL, the African Journal Online database, or not? And generally they don't. And in that case, why not? And you can see here the percentage of the synthesis that said that they did provide full details about the databases they searched in, or the search terms that they used, isn't as high as they should be. So I made a bunch of recommendations in this article I've spoken to the journal at their 20th anniversary presented there. And some of the recommendations I made were to make greater efforts to build research capacity worldwide, including targeted recruitment of researchers from underrepresented groups to the editorial board, and in particular, from Africa, Oceania, South America, to perhaps, have special issues that target underrepresented countries or regions, as well as disciplinary areas outside of STEM. We see so many publications within the STEM field, which again is another type of underrepresentation. Also recommended starting up a peer mentoring scheme or an ECR mentoring scheme, which they're now following up on, as well as to develop methodological guidance. And we know, for example, in the field of educational technology, and perhaps it's the same with other journals, one of the journals, the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology, reported in 2018 that submissions from Africa or non-Westernized Asia faced higher desk rejection rates compared to those from Western contexts. So it's really important that journal editorial boards are working actively towards trying to increase this representation. Now, since I made these recommendations, apart from starting the an ECR mentorship scheme, working towards that and working towards developing other international guidelines, they've also refreshed their international advisory board so that it's even more representative. And now we've got a much more even distribution across different parts of the world, and also a little bit more skewed towards female representation on the advisory board. But at least they're listening, and perhaps this type of analysis is one way to help get editorial boards to listen, the editors to listen, and to realize what's going on under the hood. If you're interested, there is an openly accessible database of this analysis, and you're quite welcome to. That is the link, and obviously I'll share slides if anyone's interested. The associated article, of course, is also published, and I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you about this or any of the other analyses I've done of journals. And thank you very much.
Very good questions.
Get back to slides with the QR code.
Sorry.
Can we get back to slides with the QR code?
Can we have the slides back, the final, the QR code?
QR code, we've got to see the
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Quick.
Beg your pardon, I was too quick. I was, conscious about time and not wanting to talk for too long, because once I get started,
Yeah, I know the feeling.
I hope I didn't speak too quickly. I apologize if I did.
That one, or Questions?
There is one in the chat,
On
actually.
the chat, yes, yeah.
Yes, okay. What advice would you give a PhD researcher who wishes to take a publishing monopoly-aware approach to their literature review?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a really great question. I would strongly advise that you do search you should be searching within 4 platforms as a minimum anyway. And by that, I mean not just searching within like one Web of Science and searching the SSCI and the ESCI, would be, searching Web of Science, searching Scopus, searching ERIC, but also searching things like the African Journals Online database, so using Google Scholar. Obviously, it has its limitations. But I strongly recommend using the freeware Publish or Perish. It's available. I'll pop the link in the chat shortly. It enables you to search a lot and get a lot more search results. The search is a lot more refined than just the website on Google Scholar. And of course, it enables you to capture research outside of the standard databases. I would also recommend searching places like academia or ResearchGate, where we know a lot of Global South researchers are trying to also publish and upload their research there. I would also strongly recommend using the retracted article function in reference management software like Zotero, because I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the research that gets published in more predatory journals does get retracted more often, and it's really important that we stay on top of that as well. Now, I don't use the predatory journal list. I generally don't tend to take out, for example, MDPI journals if I'm conducting a review. That is a source of contention with a lot of people. That is one approach you could take, and you could justify that for sure. But yeah, I think those would be my top tips off the top of my head. Happy to answer more questions though outside of this.
Thank you. And then over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's probably a question for both of you in some way, because I wanted to ask you that question as well. It's about the review process and the role of the reviewers, and probably a lot of you are like me, like receiving like an incredible number, of papers to review, and they are like a tough decision to be made, and also on the part of the journal, I was wondering. I think you suggested that, and probably you too. I mean, I think we're publishing too much in a way compared to what it was. So there's clearly an inadequation between the potential of reviewer. And I was wondering whether the journals you looked at and what you've seen about the kind of African context, is there some rethinking about what the reviewing process is, or the way you people work on a pool of reviewer, or they, sometimes I receive like some, people asking me to review a paper, which actually I'm not the right person to do this. So this beyond the kind of, I know exactly why this is happening, but I was wondering whether you can see or you have examples of reshaping of the kind of process in some journals, and thinking in terms of inequalities as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can answer that first if that's okay.
Different.
So I'm actually one of the editors-in-chief of the Review of Education journal, and we are actively trying to. Normally, obviously, when articles come in, in a way, you don't necessarily want that to where people come from. You don't really want that to shape the decision. It should be based on the quality of the research. But we have actively taken a stance to try and champion more Global South research. And so if we see something come in that comes from that particular research, that particular region or regions in the world, trying to support them in, if it's not quite, perhaps if an article comes in that's not quite ready, but you see the potential, we really want to support those authors. We do have a the peer mentorship scheme that can help provide some critical assistance in trying to get that article to a state where we can easily send it for peer review, or we also choose to send them for peer review perhaps a bit sooner than we would if it was authors coming from different regions. We're also trying to actively look for research that is focused on, like, coming from where the research was undertaken in underrepresented parts of the world. That we're also not just championing the authors themselves, but also trying to extend conversations to those particular regions as well in the evidence and the research that they're producing. So they are a couple of approaches that we're taking, actively being mindful of who we're supporting and not perhaps where we might have in the past, where editors might just purely desk reject because they don't think the article is quite ready, seeking other ways of supporting those researchers to try and help them get published. Yeah.
So, I mean, just in terms of what I see in terms of debates in the whole field, there's a lot of discussion around moving to an open form of peer review, and PLOS One, which is one of the biggest science publishers, is moving to a sort of submit, review, publish model, where it becomes a version of it once it's been reviewed openly, and so there are lots of different models. And I think the open review one is interesting, where the reviewer is usually named, and you can see what they said, and you can see the responses. So you get some credit. I mean, lots of discussion around how you might credit them. In some cases, there is a move to pay. Especially as a small journal in Africa, people are paying on mobile phone credits at that level, and this is sort of very basic. But I mean, then the other consequence, of course, is we're all just spammed by review requests. So it's all automated, and I know that it's not Simon Marginson asking me to review. It's he's plugged it into the computer, and it's sort of the emails are coming from the system, so to speak. And I think that's how the publishers are dealing with. They're having to email even more people. And so yeah, I think it's fraying. The system is fraying, but I don't think anyone's really got a solution. I think the AI will probably start being used by journals a bit more to sort of as integrity checks. But then we all know what that means. It's an arms race between the AI used to sort of hide quality flaws, and then the AI used to sort of find them. And so it's not great.
I think there was a question here, and then yeah.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to know if you know of other studies that pointed out the flaws in journals, and then those journals using this sort of bibliometric data to rectify its editorial practices, because that could be one approach that we can do at the individual level to address the journals' inequalities, in whatever that means.
Well, I know that. So I also did a similar analysis of the British Journal of Educational Technology for their 50-year anniversary, and there were some recommendations provided there. But I actually never heard of anything else as a result of that, and it was specifically a request by them to conduct it. So actually, that's a very, very good question as to whether or not they actively made any changes, and perhaps something I should follow up on. But I think that's what impressed me so much, about the approach of this particular journal, was that they did, they have already within a couple of months put into place, a response, and are actively trying to address some of the issues. So I'll think about that and see if I can find out. Now, I don't know of any others though, sadly. Myself.
Well,
I don't know if anyone else
wrote, yes, I'm just asking because I wrote a bibliometric analysis of a top journal in linguistics, and again, they did not take any of the recommendations, which included more representation of the global South. So I'm just curious that, yeah.
Did you get in touch with them since then to ask whether or not,
On one-to-one basis, but they have not taken any actions at the level, but obviously at the personal level, yeah.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that, I mean, I have a quick look at the journal website. I think you're in the International Advisory Board of the journal, aren't you?
I have since I've done this. I've been
You've joined
invited on, but only
okay.
since I did it.
Okay, that's interesting. That's really helpful because that suggests then that they are willing and interested in what you've done. Because I was wondering about how I would feel if you didn't sort of name and shame them. You produced just some data, really, didn't you? You weren't being judgmental. But one thing I found really interesting. Well, perhaps you were. I mean, perhaps you were, but you were doing it in a very polite way. You were sort of pointing to their gaps.
I didn't hold back, but
But you didn't turn it into a publication that somehow sort of No, that's I get it. You didn't hold back. No. Well, one question I have for you about the journal, and it's really interesting the way it's funded by these four institutions that the founding is that it hasn't expanded very much. And that therefore means its rejection rate's really high, and it's got the citation rate that's really high. It's a very interesting model of resisting expansion and volume. And if you compare it to the Journal for Education, which now publishes more than 200 papers a year, it looks like this journal only publishes less than 50 a year, if that. Which it's very interesting.
60.
Yeah. So they've always made an active choice not to expand. Is that right?
Yes, it is. And they've been very vocal about the fact that they want to maintain the quality of the research that they're publishing. And that they have been pushed by, they have been asked by screeners.
Yeah,
they've been asked to increase the number that they're publishing, but they're resisting. And I think that it is. It's brilliant.
Because there are some cases of journals or editors walking away from journals when they're under so much pressure from publishers to expand. Yeah.
There's a great question.
Yes, we'll come to that. Yes, James, one in the room as well. Sorry, we'll come to you, Deborah.
I was thinking back a little bit on Vincent's questions and about reviewers, because it's very evident and you can see authors diversity and you can see editorial boards diversity, but we don't know about reviewers because of the blind peer review process. We have no clue. And the reality is when you're on the other side and asked multiple times to review and put in a manuscript, you're getting to the people the journals and I don't know any of the journals in South Africa, for instance. So if they ask me, I'm going to say no because I have a request from someone I know, from a journal I know, and I'm going to prioritize that. So there's also this problem behind the scenes of this kind of echo box where you stay within your network, within your knowledge, within your own culture. And if you don't open up, and if you manage to get, even as an editor, I was an editor, you ask your friends. So they're the one who are going to say yes, of course, that's also the problem. So there's also this huge problem in the publishing industry that there's a blockage in going beyond and, maybe increasing that culture to other people doing research in other ways, which is fine, and to beyond your own little network and echo box of research. It's just a comment.
There was also a question. I'll just ask a question as well, and then you can respond to Ariane as well as the question on the chat. Can you speak to any experience you have with the Diamond Open Access movement and scholarly platform in Cape Town?
Well, I was there, so Deborah, hi. Obviously I could speak to it, but it'd be interesting. I mean, the journal, your journal, you analysed is a Diamond Open Access journal because it's funded by the institution. It doesn't call itself that, does it? I wonder why. No.
I'm not sure.
It's an awful term.
Sure.
Because?
It just feels like it's really elite, the diamond.
Oh, it's interesting.
Unique, must be something so special.
Okay, well, that's really interesting because within that community, Deborah, if you want to, it's being championed as the future, okay, because it takes us beyond a gold model where publishers are getting a lot of money, and so it's a model which, in theory, is more equitable because you're not paying to read or publish.
I don't have the concept.
You like the term? Okay, interesting.
Sorry. Would you like to respond to any Ariane's points earlier?
About I think you're right about the networks. That's really interesting, and that's why and how somehow disciplines develop and develop their strengths, and why it's really hard to do interdisciplinary work, because you can see a process of formation happening around a journal, can't you? And the community gets created and tightened, and the canon gets established, and that's constantly going on, and then you have to break out and start again. So there's a constant sort of centripetal force, and then this kind of breaking up, and I don't know. There must be a sort of deeper sort of structural logic to this all, but yeah.
Thank you. We might need to move on. I'm sorry. I did power of the chair. I've got a paper to present as well with my
Yes,
colleague.
please do. Yes, yeah.
It's,
UK sharing.
I think so.
Yeah, great.
It's coming. Yes, perfect. You just adjust the screen. Yeah, I mean, let's try. Okay, there you go.
All right, so we're going to be presenting today on a research project which is funded by the Society for Research into Higher Education. It's on knowledge production on higher education, looking specifically at journal editorial boards, networks, and working practices. So there are three contexts that factor into the way that this field is understood. And the first is the academic publishing model, which a lot of colleagues have spoken on this before, this kind of relationship between the producers of knowledge and the people or the institutions that disseminate that knowledge, and where those inequalities kind of lie, where these power dynamics are in operation. So the fact that these knowledge producers are working within an economic model, or the knowledge producers are reliant upon the cultural capital that these knowledge disseminators have in their possession, and they have to kind of navigate these relationships in a way that they can acquire that cultural capital. And they do that through publications, which goes into the academic career model, where there's also this flawed relationship between knowledge production and career progression. So in academia, I'm sure we all know the publish or perish model.
Can be both at the same time.
Where if you do not produce these scholarly publications, you are at risk of having a fairly stagnant career. And a lot of progression is contingent upon being able to produce knowledge in these high-ranking, prestigious journals and being cited many times. But what happens is that in order to have these high-value publications, you're engaging with these gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers are operating by their own, by the academic publishing models, which are a lot more economic in focus. And then, of course, you have the new public management system, where higher education itself is in this state of becoming massified, marketized, this emphasis on managerialism. And at the same time, you have this academic solidarity that's developing, or could be developing as a consequence of it, this idea that collective action can take place. And at the same time, whether this individual or collective complicity with this new public management system is affecting the way that the publishing industry and its relationship with authors is continuing, All right. So we have, obviously, these are really complex contexts that we're dealing with. So we have to think in a really broad kind of extensive way about each of these contexts. So the way we've done this is we've developed a few research questions, and it's based around what the overall network for higher education journal editorial boards looks, how these networks look. And then that's kind of the quantitative side of it. And then there's also the qualitative side, which is how do editorial board members see the journal practices in relation to being gatekeepers of knowledge and these global and local relationships.
So we took a couple of different approaches to do all of this. The whole project came out of a previous paper that Anto, Biz, and myself did on looking at sociology journals. So we looked at sociology journal aims, published a paper that the references at the end, and editorial board network. So we fundamentally looking at the networks of these boards. That was the kind of starting point. But we also, for the higher education journals here, we also wanted to look at how higher education journal editorial boards kind of talk about their practices. So what is the logic of making up the board? What is the logic of inviting new people? What is the kind of issues around review, besides the things we were just discussing? How did they position their own journal in the field of higher education? So we're kind of looking at these issues, and we're very much in the process of doing this project, despite the fact that we have a report due at the end of the month. So we're still collecting interviews, we're still talking to people. At the moment, we've got 15 interviews roughly across 7 cases. We're trying to go interestingly to editorial journal editors, 0 response. I'm a bit, yeah, I will be pushing a little bit more, but we shall see. The response rate has been a bit tricky, I think, precisely because this is such a niche area to kind of push people on. Really high power, very important academics might not actually find this really interesting to talk to us. Plus, I think the political context, for instance, in the US has kind of meant that we had a pretty bad response from US colleagues because they've got bigger issues right now. We are going to look at journal aims. We're not talking about that today just yet. So this is the work of our colleague Anto, who got really excited about network analysis, and she's been doing this kind of 2-mode network analysis where she looks at editorial board members as one set of events, and looks at the journal affiliation as the other set of events. So what you can do with that is actually see where people are connected to multiple different boards and how they actually position as individuals within that network. So we will see the kind of editorial board interlocking is the term where you sit on multiple boards and you kind of connect the network yourself through those affiliations. The journals, and I think you can critique this, we used Scopus to look at the journals, and we were looking at journal titles that have in the title higher education, tertiary education, or college, and then discounted those that were not relevant, that weren't actually about higher education as such. So that was our way of selecting these journals across these 50 something, 58 journals. There's 14 components, but it's only the first 2 that have multiple journals in them. The first one being 44 journals and kind of interlocked and interlinked editorial board membership across that. Anto used R to provide these iGraph package with the iGraph package, where she was using the board membership and the journals as the two modes for the network analysis. The 2 things that we calculated, or Anto calculated for this, is degree centrality and betweenness, and I will talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Basically, the degree centrality is the total connections of a given node, the extent to which a specific node is connected with other nodes in the network. So it's different forms of power within the network, whereas betweenness is a measure of a node's influence on the network overall, and could actually show resources and information flow. So the first component looks like that. This is the second component. As you can see, it's basically 2 journals interlinked by 2 people. But I think the biggie obviously is the first component. But we have 44 journals and a total of 1,700 unique editorial board members. As you would expect, and we will show this in the report, we haven't brought that particular graph here. The editorial boards are hugely skewed towards the US and UK. It's not a surprise given what we just talked about, both in Melissa's and David's talk. Interestingly, Taylor and Francis, given how they are slightly less of a comparatively and potentially smaller publisher in this field, that they really, really strongly went out and acquired or set up or gained journals. So they are a really, really big player in the field. We've got other smaller, bigger publishers and several different institutional publishers that have higher education journals. This is another area where we will look at in a bit more detail at a later stage, looking at communities across the components. So, for instance, you can see community 4 is all those journals that do technology in higher education. The community 9 and 13 seems to be different iterations of US journals interlinking and forming a community of some sort.
And 11?
Sorry?
And 11?
I'll be able to tell you that because I didn't actually make notes on that particular one.
But it seems like there's lots happening in the 11th.
Yes,
so
yeah. I think there are a couple of communities, and this is where I need to get my head around properly community analysis. There's a couple of them that are huge communities, so there's no clear thematic interlink. The smaller communities are more obviously detectable how they interlink. In terms of the top journals in the field for centrality in betweenness, you can see that higher education is one of the strongest in terms of betweenness. So the number of times a node is actually included in the shortest path connecting to other nodes. Whereas teaching in higher education is quite interesting. The total of connections for a given node is the highest. So they're the kind of the linked to most other nodes in the network. And then we've got a couple of case studies in a few minutes.
Yes. So after conducting the interviews, we have noticed a few tentative themes, which I'm just going to speak on really briefly here. So firstly, there's this notion of a dedication to the journal, and this largely manifested around editorial board members and what makes an ideal member of an editorial board. So a lot of interviewees cited the state of academia and the publish or perish model, and then just generally having a lack of time. And what journals seek in reviewers is people who are going to be dedicated to identifying these good scholarship and the kind of pressure to have the time and be able to speak to the discipline, assure quality, which you may notice is another one of the themes that appears in the discussions that we had. And this quality assurance is more of a focus on the role of the editorial board members. So how the members themselves conceptualize what they are meant to do on the board. And a lot of times they spoke about being required to identify this good scholarship, but at the same time in identifying what is considered good scholarship, they're also a lot of them cited different agendas that are in place. So there's that agenda of inclusivity. There's that pressure to diversify, especially if you have international in the title of your journal. And then at the same time, there's also journal efficiency, and that ties back into the journal itself. So the pressure to find relevant articles in good amounts of time and rely upon people who can have a quicker turnaround time. And that is very highly linked to that dedication to the journal and the state of academia as well, having the time outside of your normal day-to-day responsibilities to identify a high quality publication. So within that, there's the internal journal community. And this theme is referring to the amount of internal cohesion there is within the journal. So how clearly the expectations and the values of the journal are communicated between editorial board members themselves, how closely connected these editorial board members feel to other board members and to the leadership, how clearly communication is established between leadership and the editorial board members, as well as the publishers, because they also hold stakes in the journal itself. And linking to that is this idea of wider context and connections. So this is not just the journal itself, it's how the journal kind of reaches out and makes connections with other entities. So these can be editorial board members on other journals. This can be audience, authorship. I had one participant who spoke about how they viewed themselves as ambassadors, an ambassador for the journal, going out and trying to identify the authors who could be publishing in their journal. And a lot of times these were postgraduate students as well. So being an advocate for the journal and being able to extend their network a bit further. And again, that can refer to other publishers, other journals, and oftentimes this is done through social media as well as conferences within the country and outside. And then finally, there's this idea of, or this theme of divergence and homogeneity. So how divergence and homogeneity manifest within the journal and their practices. And these concepts can be reproduced by publishers. They can be reproduced through journal rankings. And you can see some of the practices that journals have are sometimes in place to address these issues. So a lot of times they talk about refreshing the board. The board needed to be refreshed because it wasn't diverse enough. We needed more scholars from this region in order to properly assure the quality of the articles that we're producing. So these values appear in different practices of journals. And yeah. So we just have a few quotes here. Yeah, you can just take a read through. You can kind of see some of the themes manifesting in the actual interview quotations. So the top one is based around quality assurance. A lot of interviewees talked about methodological quality as well as theoretical quality. Again, you can see the use of metrics and how these different mechanisms used within journals are influencing how diversity and homogeneity appears in the authorship, as well as the way that the journal presents itself.
I think that the second one is interesting because it's kind of talking about especially geographical diversity, where there has been a bigger drive in that particular journal to try and shore up authorship from regions where they don't get topics, but also especially regions where they don't get anything from. So they kind of went out and diversified the board a little bit in the hope that they could actually act as ambassadors for the journal and could actually bring in those voices from elsewhere. So these are all international journals, potentially edited from, you know, the global center, UK or Europe or America, and they kind of talk about how we need to actually focus on other regions as well. There was some reflection on this sort of open access. Even you know, these are, most of them are that we interviewed were from one of the bigger publishers. There was a reflection on what we do and how we are complicit, and that's a really, really interesting discussion, I think, that we haven't actually had the chance to explore in too much detail. I think, again, the first one is kind of talking to the variety of voices, to be able to bring in diversity, diverse voices through focusing on different aspects of higher education, different, but also, both in terms of kind of regional diversity, but also I think there was some reflection on the kind of career levels as well, to kind of acknowledge that this is really, really key in terms of getting ahead in academia. Then there's also a reflection on what the boards are for, and I think there's a huge diversity in that, and how journals actually treat the board, diversity across, but also diversity over time, because as editors change, the approach to the editorial boards will change. So it's really interesting to see how, you know, there's a reflection on that we haven't used them or we have overused them. Now we have to do something completely different, how we actually reacted and worked with our editorial boards. There's also quite a lot of diversity in terms of scale of editorial boards and kind of what the editorial team is, the magnitude of that, but also how then the editorial board is made up, whether that's focusing on just the kind of national or international networks. So I think it will be really interesting analysis to bring together and see the different models basically for editorial boards as they stand in 2023, 2025. So watch this space. Oh, we've got this discussion slide, but I forgot that.
So in terms of the major themes and what we've picked out from doing this research is that there's often that idea of motivation and dedication. So what a journal is for, if it's to give back to the community and how well it's doing that through practices like quality assurance and ensuring that diverse voices are heard as well. And then that ties back into the ideal editorial board member and how those members are identified, and then how that is going to vary depending on the journal, and that will influence the kind of knowledge that is produced in the field. And we do have to acknowledge some of the limitations of the study, which I think we brought up in earlier slides, but again, the response rate was around 20%. The view of publishers themselves was missing largely from the data. We are seeking to cover that gap, but a lot of times what we found was that the role of the publishers was actually fairly invisible to journal members. They did not have a lot of contact with the publishers themselves. Largely that relationship was maintained with the editor-in-chief, and they had the biggest amount of communication with the publishers. But other than that, in my interviews, it seemed that the publisher was its own entity. It focused on its own, on the publication logistics, and didn't fall into the kind of purview of the editorial members themselves.
Yeah, I think that notion of being a representative for a Horde word region is always a one to critique as well, and kind of engage with. So this is where we are. That's our previous paper on sociology journals. That didn't look at editorial workings. That was just on networks and aims. And we will at some point publish, hopefully open access. And thank you.
So the analysis is really interesting about the sort of tightness of the community, which doesn't surprise me. What doesn't surprise me, but the sort of questioning of where we are with was one thing about hating the commercial.
Yeah.
But there didn't seem to be much discussion, or perhaps you haven't heard it, about how we might rethink, because there are all sorts of other models of sharing knowledge, and people increasingly blogging or finding other forms of because in some ways the journal model is potentially under threat, and so we're at boards are having big conversations about that sort of thing.
Those have, in my interviews, they haven't been discussed in great detail. So I was surprised as well, because I thought it would actually come up more. And I was kind of pushing on the question of publishers, relationship with publishers, thinking around open access, thinking about kind of bringing in diverse voices. You can't do that through some of the current models. There was some reflection on how do we actually bring in people from word regions where they can't actually read our stuff because it's too expensive and the libraries weren't able to afford. There was something like that, but there wasn't any reflection on how do we actually go beyond that. Okay. Yeah, I think that's what it was.
Yeah. I think it just confirms how trapped we are.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had an interview where the individual I was speaking with was referencing practices of another journal that she sat on, and they did a full-scale restructuring of their journal quality assurance practices, and she spoke about how their review process has become much more personal with authors. So rather than evaluating a manuscript and saying, okay, you need to revise and resubmit, they would actually go on a FaceTime call. That was required. Yeah, so it had to be, there was that level of face-to-face contact and discussion happening with the author to assure that their expectations were being properly communicated, because you can only get so much across if you're filling in a comment box. But that was a unique case. I think a lot of times journal members are prepared to critique the process that is in place, but they haven't. It seems that discussions around alternatives do not seem to come up as organically. Yeah.
I think you mentioned this, that some journals have done writing workshops, which I think is one of the ways in which you can, coming from Eastern Europe, I know how difficult it is to get into any of these journals, and I have had these conversations with some of my colleagues back home, and it's incredibly tricky when you don't know the game exactly, that precise issue. But I don't think any of the higher education journals have done that, because I only know the Compara that has done it. I don't know whether any other journals who have gone out and made sure that these workshops are happening in places where people can benefit from it. Sorry, yes.
When I published my first journal article, I wondered why I wouldn't publish all of my remaining articles in that journal.
Yeah.
I still don't know the answer, actually, except if I publish in a different subject matter. But my question to you is, are those tightly bound groups publishing in their journal, or how much are they being unfaithful in publishing in other journals, though it might be within the subject, or maybe they don't, maybe they feel it greedy publishing too much in their, how much plurality is there?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important point, and I don't think we've got a good answer for this from our own interviews. It did come up in some discussions, and I think there is basically two ways of thinking about it. If you're an editor, you've got too much of a power over the journal, therefore you shouldn't actually publish in your journal.
I agree with that. Yeah.
That's one. But if you're an editorial board member or an editor, you should be publishing in your journal because you're actually a part of the community, right? Because you're an ambassador yourself for the journal, so therefore you should actually. And it is I think it's a really tricky balance. I don't think that there's a clear cut answer to this. It's an ethics question. Very often it comes up as an ethics question. Can you actually be independent enough of your own decision-making process?
That was a really interesting point that came up in some of the interviews, was that perception of how much contact an ideal editorial board member would have had with their journal prior to becoming an editorial board member. Sometimes you got people who would say, oh, we would reach out to people who had reviewed for us before or who had published in the journal before. And some would say, well, we really don't want to focus on that because we don't want that to limit our perspective of who is a qualified editorial board member.
Yeah, I think that issue arises, well, I'll just say Oxford Review of Education.
Yeah.
There's a close overlap of different kinds of interest and not only publishing interest.
Yeah.
So I don't know how, I haven't looked at it very closely.
I think it would be slightly different analysis to look at precisely this, how, but it's also, I think, editorial board membership changes over time. And it's really difficult to track it. We've tried all sorts of different things. It's impossible to go back in the data over time. It's tricky because this is one of the things that we wanted to do, look at the network and change, but it's not easy.
Because in some ways you're sort of conflicted. I mean, as an editorial board, you're meant to be an active reviewer. That's partly what you're there for. But then you're also recruiting papers and so there's a sort of conflict of interest almost within the
Just curious about disciplines. And so I think I've read about how with these Scopus and whatever indexed papers, they're mainly in like the medical and the natural sciences. And so my field is the humanities and literature. And I know the top journal in my field is published by Cambridge University Press. And I remember I went to a conference and then I asked them, I'm like, well, are you in that? And then she just scoffed. She's like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like, we would never, And this is like this is the most coveted, like, I don't know what their interest rate is, And so it's like the International Journal of Middle East Studies. And so my question is, and so for me, and then it's everything you've already said. So at our university, it's the same. Like if we don't publish for us, it's Scopus, right? So if it's not published in Scopus indexed articles, it doesn't count towards promotion, even in-depth review or like end of year review. And so it puts us in this double bind. Well, like that we're being compromised in terms of our field and field specificity. And then, I'm not a doctor. I am a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I can't publish in those, articles, in those journals. So I don't know if my question is clear, but it's about just discipline as well. Like which disciplines get valued as scientific and high end and which disciplines just get dismissed because, I don't know, they're not indexed.
But it's so interesting that a journal can be so sort of tightly secure of its reputation, but it's not worried about being indexed. I mean, that's an amazing research community that considers for the rest of the world. Yes.
like ridiculous.
But that also is very exclusionary because it means probably that they sort of end up not reaching out to alternative voices or
No, yeah, it's a very, and like when I submitted, for instance, the journal, the editor replied to me, is like, this is a great idea, it needs revision, but because we're backed up for 5 years, I suggest you publish it somewhere else. So like, well, thank you.
5 years is like, in 5 years' time you can publish something. I mean, that's just amazing.
I don't even obsolete So, but yeah.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time. I'm really sorry that Sylvia Loma was going to come and talk about her new journal, which again is a very different model.
What's the journal called?
International Students something.
Okay.
I always forget what iteration they are.
And why is it a different model?
They just set it up now.
I see, okay,
It's just coming in open access.
Oh, okay. So it's Born Diamond.
Yes, Born Diamond. I just wish it was a different term for that.
Yeah.
Gold and the diamond. Anyway, thank you very much for coming today and your questions.